Okay, check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. I believe I'm live. Let me know if I'm live. Let me know if I'm audible. In fact, let me just turn my camera on. Let me know if I'm audible and I'm visible, so I know. Just give me a quick heads up. Give me a shout on the chat, by the way. Just let me know that I can be seen and heard live. Mercuria says, superb. I'm hoping that you can hear me. Just give me a audio is good, visuals are good, and then I know I'm live and I'm audible. Okay, superb. All right, we're good. I'm getting the feedback, so fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining me. This is really impromptu, totally unplanned. Had absolutely no idea I was going to do this, but I just really felt like going live, to be totally honest with you. But this is a subject or a topic that I feel like I've been tackling quite a lot in my recent posts. So I thought it would be good to have a discussion with it. And it's one of those topics where I haven't in any way, shape or form formulated a thesis or a theory around exactly how it works. But at the same time, I've got a good idea, and I think it would be a good topic for us to have a bit of a discussion around, because I guess the one thing that I can say with a degree of certainty is that when it comes to the mainstream narrative on this topic, I certainly don't subscribe to that. And that's going to be quite interesting, because obviously my channel is about, there's a huge focus on obviously on African history, ancient African history, with a huge lean towards Kemet at the moment. Obviously I plan to do other African civilizations as well, but I feel like there's kind of ground to cover in the topic of Kemet before we move on to other civilizations. But I think in being in that position where I'm presenting Kemet's history, there is a tendency, I think, on the side of people to assume that I have a certain way of thinking. And to put a long story short, I think in the melanated community, I was going to say African, but I think it exceeds African, and this is why this topic's come up as well. But in the melanated community, I do think we have a tendency and a leaning towards dogma and myopia. I don't think that's a negative thing necessarily, because I was always taught growing up that we're kind of like more spiritual beings, but most of us are raised in religious households, and whether or not we stay in that religion or leave that religion, we tend to go from one set of beliefs or into another. So in essence, there'll be a group of people, and this, I'm not going to say this is right or wrong, this is totally your choice, but there'll be a group of people who've decided, I'm not Christian anymore, I follow the laws of Ma'at. Or I'm not Christian anymore, I'm Islam. Or I'm not Islam anymore, I'm Christian. And we tend to kind of, or I'm not that anymore, I'm Voodoo. Or I'm not Voodoo anymore, and so on. So we tend to kind of fall from one set of beliefs to the other. Whereas I felt my transition away from Christian faith, so to speak, was not so much a transition away from Christian faith as it was a transition into opening up my understanding and being willing to take truth from whichever way it presents itself. And as a result, I'm just not of any faith. Essentially, I'm not of any faith, and in some ways I'm of all faiths, because no faith scares me, no set of beliefs scares me, no knowledge scares me, no book scares me. I'm willing to open up any book, and in this regard, any topic. So that's what we're going to discuss. That's what we're going to discuss today, because this is it's a quite a loaded topic, and I certainly don't intend to get to an answer at the end of it. Well, I guess the question is, and looking at the thumbnail, the question mark is that we're going to be discussing, where do we all come from? Where do all black people come from? Are we all Africans? You know, as we've been led to believe, do all black people essentially come from Africa? And this is quite a loaded question because everyone's straight away thinking, well, everyone comes from Africa originally. And I'd say, well, I probably would agree with that. And I even say that tentatively because so much has been hidden from us. But what does it mean when we say that all black people come from Africa? Because if everyone comes from Africa, then everyone comes from Africa. So why do we call ourselves Africans? It becomes meaningless then, doesn't it? So this is something that we're going to chat about. We're going to uncover. Let me get into some of the chat that's going on at the moment. Okay, nothing too much I have to cover. I don't want to miss anything. Do research for Dr. Delbert Blair. Search for the facts yourselves. We've always been here. Cool. I don't know who Dr. Delbert Blair is, Sonia, but I'm very, very happy to look into them. Yeah, brilliant. Hit up the likes. We've got, how many have we got? We've got about 70 people live so far. Okay, so yeah, fantastic. Hit up the likes. Let's get some more people in here. And let's open up this discussion. So there's so many things to kind of tackle in this. And like I said, I'm not going to try and approach this from a heavily scientific point of view, because in many ways, I think the science is sketchy. Because you'll hear people come with theories and they'll be like, even someone comes with out of Africa theory, they'll say, oh, you know, people started migrating out of Africa. You know, I think the current theory now is 70,000 years ago. Now, I could tell you right now with a relative amount of confidence and comfortability, that figure was 1/3 of that. It was 25,000 years ago, literally, if you go back 15 years. So that's how much that figure has changed and how quickly that figure has changed. They constantly change these figures about how long ago it was that man first walked off the African continent and started to people the rest of the world. And you'll find that figure kind of will just change up and down with how much they want it to coincide with their outlook on history and anthropology. And it changes constantly. So for that reason, I'm not going to tackle dates too much. I'm just going to kind of look at different theories that we have. And then looking at those different theories, maybe start to share some of my belief systems, formulate some understandings, answer some questions, allow myself to be challenged, maybe challenge each other on this chat. Very, very happy and very open to do that. Okay. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to change my screen to my other one. I am sipping tea again, by the way, which I learned actually is apparently a Nigerian thing as well. So apparently it's the Nigerian in me that makes me like tea so much. So there you go. That was quite comforting to know. I always thought it was the English in me, but there you go. Let's go. All right. So let's switch over. All right. Brilliant. So interesting place to start on this topic. I thought an interesting place to start on this topic is somewhere that you probably wouldn't expect. And we're going to start with some maps, bizarrely enough. Okay. I'm going to show you some maps. So maps is a topic, by the way, if you're kind of subscribed to the channel, you'll know that maps is a topic that I love to revisit every now and then. I think maps are incredibly interesting. But the reason I thought what's the best way to tackle this topic and maps would be a good place to start is because essentially when it comes to maps, we've been fed kind of a steady diet of BS, and this is not going to be news to anybody, but obviously this is the Mercator projection map, which is the most common one. It would have been the one that we all had in school. It would have been the one that we've all seen growing up. And well, I could ask the question, but I think you all know the question. Does anyone know what's wrong with this map? Well, I'm sure everyone will know what the answer is in terms of what's wrong with this map. And the answer is that this map is totally inaccurate in terms of its scale. It's scaled totally inaccurately. This is Greenland, and as you can see, Greenland is almost the same size as Africa, which is totally out. North America is humongous, and Europe over here is about 2/3. So if you look at the landmass of Europe, it's about 2/3 the size of Africa. So in terms of as a lot of people have said in the chat, shape of the landmass is wrong. The sizes are not in true proportion. Africa is made small. All of the above is true. So you can see, looking at this map, and this is the map that everyone's kind of used to, that, you know, things are basically well out of whack. And if we're going to start having a perspective about what the origins are, where we kind of come from, I think having an idea of scale can be really helpful, because sometimes when you talk about the phenotypic and the genotypic diversity of Africa, which is something that I bang on about constantly, it can kind of get missed if we feel like the land mass of Africa is, you know, cramped, or in some regards kind of, you know, this size, when it's actually, you know, much larger in reality. So the map, there's a map actually that's come out quite recently, okay, and this is the map here. And this map is actually rumored to be one of the most accurate maps when it comes to projections. And one of the things about this map is that, I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it's called the it's made by a cartographer company called Ortho something. Let me just quickly pull up the name. Oops, sorry. If anyone knows, feel free to jam it in the chat, by the way, while I'm busy searching for it. But I want to give you the name of this map so you kind of can have a look at it in your own time as well. Live stream. Where's it gone? Here. Oh, I thought I had the name of it. Clearly I do not. I have the name of it here. Should have just done this to begin with. So this map is called the orthograph map, and it's actually made by I think a Japanese cartographer. Okay, and this map right now is, thank you, Quadwo, you knew. Quadwo will always know. Yeah, so this map here, the orthograph map, is made by a Japanese cartography company. Someone just said they turn maps upside down, which is actually very interesting, because that comes from obviously the idea that in Kemet, upper Kemet was towards the south, lower Kemet was towards the north. So if you actually go into a lot of, I went to an Ethiopian restaurant the other day, and they show their maps, or at least the ones that I've been to, when they have pictures of the maps on the wall, they tend to show them in that reverse north-south projection. Now, obviously, upper and lower, it's said to be because the way the Nile flows. So obviously the highlands are towards the south, and the lowlands, the delta, was towards the north, which is why you had upper and lower. But that being said, the idea of map projections and orientation, I don't know, to be totally honest with you. I don't think it ultimately matters which way you orient. I'm not sure if it does, but at least that's the argument behind it. So a lot of people do say that. But yes, let me go into this anyway, because I don't want to get sidetracked too much. So yeah, looking at this map here, the reason I've shown you this map is so we can get an idea of scale. Okay, so this is the orthograph map. There is another map actually that I think does just as good a job, and this is the azimuthal equidistant map. So this is the same one we see on the UN logo, and it's the map used by people who believe in a flat earth, which I'm not going to go into today. I'm sure we'll get into that topic soon as well, because it's a very interesting one to broach. But in terms of projections, this is also a very interesting map, because it essentially does a very similar job. Somewhat, actually, I'd say a somewhat better job at showing the size of Africa in comparison to those other land masses. So if we just go back to this orthograph map, I want you to look at the size of Africa and now look at the size of Europe. So Europe, which is like 2/3 on the Mercator map, you can see in actual correct projection, Europe probably less than, and probably like an eighth of the landmass of Africa. It's absolutely tiny. Have a look at the size of the Arabian Peninsula over here. Okay, so have a look at the size of the Arabian Peninsula. It's almost the size of all of Europe. So Saudi Arabia, this huge landmass in the middle here, look at the size of that. Now, Saudi Arabia is largely just desert. and look at the size of it. It's actually the same size, almost the same size as most of mainland Europe. So get these projections into your head when you're thinking about Africa. You're talking about a landmass that literally dwarfs Europe, literally dwarfs it. And yet this tiny little landmass here that sits in the kind of corner of the world, so to speak, is now thoroughly in control of pretty much all of the land masses. So you have to really get your head around that. You have to really get your head around that. And this, obviously, I can scroll down here. I'm not even showing Australia down here as well. So Australia is down the bottom. You've got this tiny, tiny, tiny little landmass. Okay, so it's quite interesting for us to behold that, you know, when it comes to these projections, you can now see, look at Nigeria, for instance. Nigeria is probably 1/3, maybe slightly more, the size of Europe as well. So these, you know, single African nations, a couple of African nations can easily, you know, give us the same size as the landmass of Europe. And large nations such as, you know, Algeria over here, this yellow one over here, Algeria is nearly the same size as all of Europe put together. So it's really quite staggering, okay, that these tiny nations have been able to essentially, you know, take over entire huge land masses the size of their continent several times over. Think about this little insignificant nation over here, the one that I'm sipping tea from at the moment. Okay, look at this tiny nation. If it was a part of Africa, it would probably be the smallest nation, maybe, give or take. I'm not sure that is. There's that Senegambia. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. I need to zoom in and check. I'll check that later. But the tiny little nation, which, you know, essentially ruled the entire world at one point. But anyway, we've kind of done that topic to death. Now let's go into what I wanted to get into, because I really want to get into this topic. 1 second, let me just quickly check out. I'm not missing anything on the chat. Yeah, no. Arab is literally the opposite of. Okay, I'm gonna get into it because I don't think there's a massive amount that I'm missing there in the chat. Middle East are Africans. They're West Asians. Only part you could say is African would be Yemen. Interesting. We're going to get into that. We're definitely going to get into that today. Okay, so I'm going to click on something else now, because we're going to cover some theories now. And then we're going to hopefully start to formulate an answer towards the question. And the major question being, where do we all come from? Okay, so I've got a picture of this kind of projected map that I showed you earlier. I'm actually going to create a copy of that, because we're gonna need a few copies, because we're going to use these maps to kind of project the different theories about how people got where they are, and then we're going to discuss where we all came from and see if we could come to some kind of agreement, which I totally doubt, but it's always worth a try. So let's start off. So let's start off with mainstream theory about how the world got to where it was today. Okay, so I've created these little colors so that we could create a bit of a map based on the way mainstream theory works. Okay, so we've got the very dark people, okay, essentially populating here. Okay, so this is mainstream theory we were talking about here, yeah? And then mainstream theory would tell you that, so I'm starting around 1600 now. This is what mainstream theory basically says. The mainstream theory says all of the kind of, oh no, that's kind of my yellow color. Here's my beige color. All of the beige people are around here, yeah? All of the pink people essentially are here, yeah, and here, that's Russia, okay. This place over here as well is full of the beige people. Yeah, according to mainstream history. Let me know if you're following along here. Then we got down here, full of the yellow coloured people. Down here is full of a few kind of like dark brownish people. Dark to medium brown people. That would have been your Aboriginal people. Okay. And then over here, in this landmass, remember this is before the kind of widespread kind of transportation started taking place. You have red people. Now, red people don't exist anymore, but we have to believe that they existed at one time. We had, red coloured people, red skins, so to speak. Okay, red coloured people. So North America, South America, red coloured people. You might as well say the Inuits are kind of come under that red banner as well. Pink people up in Northern Europe and, Russian steppes, so to speak. Then we've got India here, which is kind of giving you those brownish, these kind of like medium to dark brown as well. So you have maybe some dark Indians there and maybe some, and then maybe some more medium tone ones there. So this is where we started. Okay, someone said red-skinned ? That is the theory. Okay, so I'm not making this up. I swear to you, this is mainstream race theory. Okay, so this is what the world looked like according to, if we're going to go by. In fact, I missed out one thing. We also have a few yellow skins over here as well. So we've got some red skins and some kind of like yellow skins kind of in the mix, making up this land mass over here. Okay. So this is where we started off with, okay, before anything took place. And essentially we have this idea that every landmass is occupied by essentially a unique race of people. So you have a unique race of people occupying a landmass, a monolith unique race of people. No one else who doesn't fit that color spectrum or doesn't fit that phenotype exists in that part of the world. And that's how mankind has been since 100,000 BC. So since 100,000 BC to 1600 AD, when the transportation started taking place. So let's say 15 to 1600 AD, for 100,000 years or however long it was, man had settled in their color groups, in their races, their major races of the world, and they had settled in these different land masses, and they couldn't reach each other. They didn't know each other essentially existed, apart from the ones maybe who were around the Mediterranean, who kind of like had a bit of interaction. Apart from that, none of these people knew the rest existed, and none of these people ever had contact with each other, and they had completely separate everything. Okay, so this is mainstream narrative. Now, what happens to change the mainstream narrative or to get us to where we are now? Well, essentially, what happens to get us to where we are now is that mainstream narrative says that the pink man started essentially going to different parts of the world. Whoops, let me shrink that properly. Yeah. Started going to different parts of the world and started transporting people to different places. So he went to Africa largely, yeah, and then he dropped a few Africans. Well, first of all, there was kind of like a trans-Saharan slave trade, allegedly, which dropped a few dark people here, yeah. We ended up with a few dark people here. We ended up with quite a lot of dark people here, didn't we? Okay, so he's, he's also taken himself here as well. So he put himself there. He's put himself there. As a result of him being there, we get a few beige people ending up there. We end up with a load of dark people there. Okay, and in different parts over there. Strangely enough, most of them disappear from there. So we don't have any of them anymore. But we got a load of them. Yeah, a load of them there. A load of them there. These ones also do a bit of a disappearing act. I mean, you get a handful of them, but most of them kind of look like this now. But a majority of the people here we know are like this. So we end up with that. We end up with a load of them there. And then we end up with spatterings of dark people, kind of just like scattered all around, depending wherever they needed slaves to do building, basically. So they needed a few slaves to do some building work, and as a result, they ended up in different parts of the globe. So, by the way, thank you to a couple of donators. Just want to say thank you really quickly to Jay. Thank you. Appreciate you, brother. Always on my live streams and supporting from the start. D Griff, thank you. We all know the mainstream is BS. People got lighter due to invasions. Well, here's another theory. Okay, so this is the mainstream narrative, and I know I kind of like beleaguered that point a little bit, but I wanted to cover it fully. Okay, so the idea is that all races sit separately on the globe, and then essentially white people went around the world picking up slaves, dropping them into different places, mixing up people, creating different hues, and now we kind of have this mixed up multicultural world that's only multicultural because essentially the European kick-started mankind's journey into, into differentiation. It kick-started the whole, melee of people mixing. That's what happened. That's the mainstream narrative. Now, I don't know if you've picked up or not, but I'm not sold on the mainstream narrative. Okay, I don't know if I've kind of like made that clear, but that certainly isn't my narrative, and it's not one that I co-sign. I actually think it's total BS, but once again, I don't want to tell anybody how to think about this. I'm just going to label this mainstream narrative. Okay. Now we're going to move on to another narrative, because there's a few narratives that I kind of want to cover, but let's get some of them out on the table. Okay. Now, the second narrative, and I'd say this is probably a narrative that I more buy into, is a very simple narrative to show and to describe. And that essentially is that people existed in different hues on pretty much every continent at that same point in time. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to start here. I'm going to show that. And once again, this is my opinion. So obviously people are very, very welcome to disagree with this. But this is certainly the mindset that I have when it comes to these things. Whoops, didn't mean to move that. Let's undo that. Sorry. Just try to get this done as quickly as possible. Okay. Certainly up there. Okay. With maybe a sprinkling there and certainly there. And then obviously we know the story here. And we know the story here. So this is my view of the world in 1600, okay? And it's not just something that I've just drummed up, it's something that I've had reinforced. And actually, this is where this conversation will get interesting / controversial, because once again, I'm just going to be sharing you things that I essentially believe, but don't necessarily have full evidence to back it. So this is more of a discussion than anything, and I'm very happy to hear from different people's points of view. But one of the things that I started believing a really long time ago, and I have reasons for believing this, but one of the things I believed a very, very long time ago, for instance, is that the melanated people around the world didn't all come from Africa. And I'm not saying that they weren't in Africa originally, however many tens of thousands of years we gotta go back. But I'm going to say at the point of 1600 AD, when people started appearing in different places, or at least we started getting told people were appearing in different places, they were already there. And they had been there for thousands of years. And they had been there long enough for their origin, and this is the key point, they had been there long enough for their origin in Africa to be irrelevant. And I've had this discussion before where I say, wow, at what point do you stop calling yourself an African? Because the reason we call ourselves African today is because African is attached to our melanated skin. So as a result of being someone that's melanated, you therefore have to assign, or therefore have to take pride in the fact that you're from the African continent. Now, for me as a Nigerian, that's easy. However, for some other people on this earth who are of melanated skin, but whose ancestors have not been African for several thousands of years, asking them to identify with Africa is a bit ridiculous. And this is the issue. Mainstream narrative, or narrative number one, suggests that all African people, all melanated people were restricted to this continent, and only the ones with fairer or lighter skin had the common sense and the ability to move off the continent into different parts of the world. They were the only ones with the ingenuity to make it, and all of the ones who were of melanated skin didn't manage to get there until they were dropped there by ships. Okay, so that's essentially the narrative that we're fed, and I want to kind of like stress the fact that that narrative doesn't make much sense in the scheme of things. However, when I look at, or at least when I'm sharing this theory, the theory that I'm sharing with you is that actually multiculturalism around the world was rife. Different hues of people existed on every continent, and actually what's happened in this period of time that we call the slave trade, or what's happened in this period of time that we call colonialism, is actually people have been rounded up. So this is where I'm going to go into phase two. What actually happened is that people, the pink man or the white man, or whatever you want to say, the European, I should say, okay, went around different places. So let's say here, and obviously here, and here, and here, and here, and certainly here. And actually, as a result of being there, there was a process of decimation. Okay, so when Europeans or the British arrived in Australia, they erased and replaced. When the British / Spanish arrived in America, they took what was there already, they enslaved, they transported, and obviously they multiplied. So the current picture is more like this. And the same picture we can have in South America. Now, to be clear, this is one theory, and we're going to touch on quite a few here, okay? Did Nigeria have a migration of Nubians through Kanem? Also, what of Garamantes and the name Akin in Yoruba to the Nubian queen's son's name, Akinedad? Yeah, Akinedad Akhenaten as well. I'm not sure though. I haven't studied the etymological link of that yet, but that's one of the big projects I want to do, is looking into names. What was I talking to? I'm actually from, or at least my father is from a village called Idare or Idanre. And obviously I'm very knowledgeable. Well, I've noticed, I shouldn't say very knowledgeable because I'm not knowledgeable at all in this area, but I've noticed that there is a massive trend, particularly in Benin, but also in some Yoruba circles, of having re or ra at the end of village and place names. So I actually asked my mum today, what does Idare or Idanre mean? And she said, we don't know. It's just the name of a place. She was like asking me, what does London mean? I was like, oh, fair enough. I thought she was going to know, just going to be able to reel off the answer, but she's like, I don't have no idea. But it would be good for me to kind of like go back and see where this naming convention came from. Is there kind of a link there of origin as to why we have this re and ra suffix to so many of our place names? It would be interesting to know. So yeah, that's something I'd like to look into, Jay. Thank you for your second donation, buddy. Really appreciate it. Sonia, I appreciate your $3. Okay. So going back to this theory. Okay. So you have this multiculturalism that's all over Europe and Asia. All of the dark people got erased there and are essentially bred out. What colour that used to be? That looks, oh, that's a beige colour. Yeah, that goes. All of the people there essentially get bred out and erased. And then certainly when it comes to Europe and Asia, well, actually we still have a dark contingent towards the south of India, but essentially there's a complete population replacing there. So what's the point of what I'm saying here? The point of what I'm saying here is that you've got two perspectives here. You have perspective number one, and actually, sorry, let me finish this actually really quickly. So that's Africa covered mostly. North Africa becomes like this. Okay, thank you. All right, so, and I've got another perspective that I'm going to paint as well, obviously. So you've got perspective number one, that you had all of the races restricted, or I shouldn't say races, all of the phenotypes of people restricted to certain geographic quarters, not mixing, essentially not interacting, and not essentially knowing that each one are there, each one keeping a phenotypic / racial purity, so that they can be identified as a red race or a yellow race or a black race or a brown race. And then the act of colonialism, the act of imperialism, that was the word I was looking for, the act of imperialism taking place. And as a result of imperialism, people being moved, essentially. And that creates today's ethnic blend that we have. That creates all of these different races and these kind of brown people kind of like all around the world. And you even hear that quite a lot. You hear that kind of theory that, you know, America's browning, okay, which I always find very, very interesting, because I think the exact opposite is taking place. Actually, America was very, very brown to black. Black people outnumbered Europeans considerably at the end of the 1800s, when the slave trade came to a close. Black people outnumbered Europeans considerably, and now black people are a massive, massive minority in North America, at least, or in the US. So that would suggest actually America's not browning. What's taking place is actually essentially the country's whitening. And there's almost an erasure of people of melanated complexion around the globe. So we've gone from being essentially a global majority represented on every continent to a global minority. Now, that's just one theory, or at least two theories I've outlined. I want to outline a third theory, and then we're going to get into discussion about how much of this holds weight and where do I think the truth lies. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly read out the super chat. So thank you. Your theory is backed by the words of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. I'm glad you mentioned that, on how little pale skinned folk there is on the planet. Germans, Irish, Danes, Vikings were referred to as black, swarthy, etc. I'm glad you raised that. There is, essentially, if you want to know more about that theory, I suggest you have a little look around, see if you can Google and find that works by Benjamin. I know about Benjamin Franklin. I don't know about Thomas Jefferson, but I know certainly Benjamin Franklin mentions in his writings about the fact that he wishes there essentially was more white people, because there are barely any, and he speaks about the fact that England has a few, but the rest of Europe essentially is black and swarthy. And we're talking going back just 200 years now. This isn't a massive time ago. This isn't like a long, long time ago. So it's really bizarre, but it's also really kind of unsettling because of how different it is from the narrative that we've been told, this narrative that we were restricted here. And this is one of the things, if you've been on my live stream before, I've gone to the British Museum and I've kind of shown you artifacts where I've said, look, melanated people were everywhere. There's just no second guessing it. There's no doubt about it. We absolutely were everywhere. Okay. Let's go on, because I want to show you one more theory, and then we're going to kind of have a discussion about where I think things lie. So I'm just going to quickly copy one more map down. Okay. So we had this theory where essentially, moved by the mainstream narrative, moved around by Europeans. And then we had this theory I had here, which was the second theory, which was basically we started off in, I'm going to call this melanated everywhere theory. I've got names for these theories, as you can see. All right, just chill with me for a little bit. Now we see, I'm just going to read out end super chat. Now we see the spiraling of the land masses. Our labels to explain them must change. It becomes difficult to express with conventional names. Yeah, absolutely. You can hear me kind of stammering and stirring all over the place, trying to figure out what to call people without causing offense, and obviously doing an awful job. So you have the kind of like melanated everywhere theory, okay? And then I guess the other theory that you have is that it's quite similar to the previous theory, but it's the idea that actually, let me just quickly get my colors down. Sorry, got to copy these down. This is me trying to use a tool that's not made for this, but I'm so used to it. I'm being stubborn, and I'm going to use it anyway. So once again, so this theory here, and then once again, we're using kind of, we're going to use 1600, I guess, as our reference date for, when things really kicked off, so to speak, more than anything. But this theory goes on the fact that, okay, this place was full of dark-skinned. This place was full of red and dark-skinned, as was this place. Okay. And then essentially this one looks quite similar to the first one. So we're still on the idea that this place is full of these kind of people. And then you have the Mediterranean essentially full of these kind of people. Have some deep brown people down here, probably touching on Melanesia as well. And then essentially the entire north is full of these kind of people. Now, what's the main difference between this theory and the first theory that I told you? Okay. Now, the main difference between this theory and the first theory I told you is that in this theory, whoops, what did I just do? Oh dear, what did I do? Oh, almost thought I crashed everything there. Okay, cool. In this theory, I had no idea what I just did. I didn't even read the warning. I was going to shrink this down. In this theory, when the European comes here, okay, essentially no transportation takes place. So in this theory, the European arrives here, and as a result of the European arriving, these people essentially blend and become one. Okay, so these groups are basically told you're the same people. Okay, and they together are essentially enslaved and put to work. Okay, so they become your modern day African Americans. Okay, and obviously we have a bit of mixing that takes place, which results in some of this over here and results in some of this over here. Then we have these people over here aren't actually taken. It's just kind of like said. It's kind of a story that's kind of made up that they're taken. Okay. And then we have these people doing the same thing they're doing everywhere else. Once again, like I've explained before, kind of spreading over to different parts of the world and essentially multiplying their presence. All right. So 3 different theories there. Okay. So this theory says no one really moves, but we're kind of told that we are moving. So there you go. Those are the 3 theories. And I know that we kind of like went on one there because I had to kind of like lay them out. But that essentially is the 3 theories that I'm seeing, or at least I'm thinking about, that play out. So we have the main, let's kind of like recap. So we have the mainstream narrative, and we could put some arrows in here as well. So with the mainstream narrative, which basically says, let me bring these to the top, range, bring the front, cool. So we have the mainstream narrative that basically says the European went there. Okay, let me turn this pink actually. That'll make more sense. There we go. So the European went there, and then when the European went there, they took this guy and they took him all over the world. Okay, so they took the dark fella all over the world. Sorry, excuse my colloquialisms. Rage with the front. So they took the dark fella all over the world, okay, into different places, okay, where the dark fella had never been before. And as a result, we got dark fellas everywhere, basically. Okay. So that's mainstream theory number 1. Okay. I hope that's clear enough for everybody. We kind of understand that. Then we have theory number 2, where basically they were everywhere. So dark fellas were kind of, that's myself speaking there. Yeah, we were kind of everywhere. And all that happened is we had a bit of rotation take place. Some of us were erased. So we had a lot of rotation and a lot of erasure taking place. Okay. And as a result of that, we basically were replaced. So actually, I'm going to turn maybe some of these arrows this color to kind of show what we're talking about there. So there we go. So we have kind of this erasure that takes place. And then this one is the theory that no one really moved. So there were melanated people on this continent over here. There were melanated people kind of at different places, and actually everything we know about the transatlantic slave trade and people kind of moving around was a bit of a lie, because they were already there, and so they just basically kept them there. Now I guess my question to the audiences and to everyone who's listening, because this was a bit of a confusing one, but I'm glad you guys seem to be following along, is which one of these theories is true? That's the question I'm going to kind of like put out to you. Which one of these theories sounds the truest to you? Which one kind of holds water in your opinion? Because they could all be rubbish, but I want to hear what people's thoughts are. Because I have my theory, but me sitting here just telling you exactly what I think is not going to be that interesting. So I want to hear what people think. I'm going to go through some comments now whilst people generate their responses. And I'm going to kind of have a look, see what people come back with. Let me see if I missed anything. I don't know why we focus on Europeans so much when Asiatics invaded and enslaved Africans first. Europeans are like new to the power game. See, this is an interesting theory, and I'm glad you raised that. Because actually, if you come to Africa, we will tell you otherwise. And what do I mean when I say we will tell you otherwise? When you say Asiatics, I'm assuming you're talking about, the only thing you can be talking about is the Arabic expansion. If you're talking about Asiatics, okay? Because really the only people that have had an effect on the African continent other than Europeans has been Islam. But I can tell you right now with a fair degree of certainty that Islam was spread in Africa by Africans and by no one else. Okay? Groups like the Fulani had a massive impact on the spread of Islam. Okay? Tuareg, massive impact on the spread. Okay? Nothing to do with foreigners. The thing about Islamic culture is linked to a language. Okay? And that language is Arabic. And one of the tenets of the Islamic faith, or one of the prerequisites, I should say, is the acquisition, or at least taking on, of the Arabic language. It's a necessity. It's a necessity to read the holy text. It's a necessity to, and they don't like to translate the text out of that language. So you've got a holy book based in that language, and you have essentially, if a population decides to take on this faith, they have to take on this language. So you have this spread, and everywhere people see the Arabic language, they assume Arab people. But the Arab people, or the people who were classified as Arabs back then, don't have an imprint on the continent that is very large. What you have is people who acquired the Arabic language and took it on and spread that, and then either took on maybe imperialistic, or I should say, what's the word when you're spreading your faith, evangelistic qualities with a taking on of the Arabic language. But they were Africans nonetheless. They weren't other people. So this view that Arabs had a massive impact on the geography and the topography of Africa is actually incorrect. It was other Africans, and that's actually very true to this day. If you look in northern Nigeria, okay, it's full of Muslims. None of them are Arab, Okay, they're all Nigerian. They're all African, so to speak. Okay, Hausa people, they're all African. And actually, I just say Hausa people, but actually Nigeria is one of those really strange countries, been very 50-50. Yorubas are 50-50 Islam and 50-50 Christian, you know, so it's not even this view where it's tribal, you know. Islam is a very persuasive and pervasive faith on the African continent, as is Christianity. And when it's spread by the people of Africa. So this whole view that there's been this kind of like Arabs marauding through the African continent, picking up African people and plopping them in different parts of the world, bringing them over as slaves. A lot of that is nonsense. There's no historical record of these Arabs marauding through the African continent, marauding into West Africa, picking up Africans and then on camelback and then taking. It doesn't exist. So this is just one of those kind of like misnomers. Arabic and Islam was spread by Africans in Africa. So that's just something that we have to deal with as a populace. We can't point the finger or blame at someone who's outside of us when it comes to that. All right, I'm going to get to some of these people because I want to see what theories people are going with. So Olakunle said melanated everywhere. I'm leaning towards, I kind of see where you're going with that. Okay. I believe in the Africa theory, so everyone is melanated. North Africa had different types of people in history. Yes, they had blacks in North Africa, Garama, Mauritania, Libya, correct. Soul Journey of Life said the last two are more plausible. Pigtails are little white lies grown to big disastrous white lies. Someone said big facts. Firefly, I never know how to say your name, by the way. You should write down the pronunciation of that one day for me. I don't think that black phenotypes are as disadvantageous as they like to say. To think that European climate would force evolution away from blackness is completely illogical. Well, that's quite interesting. Because in some ways I see what you're saying, but in some ways we have to acknowledge that, or at least, you know what? Here's something I'll add to that. One thing that I've noticed is that phenotype shifts very quickly under a climate of oppression. Very, very quickly. The best example I can actually give you is what's taken place in Libya. Okay? A lot of people will be very surprised to know that if you look up images of Libya in the early 1900s, if you can find late 19th century, before the invasion of Mussolini, before the Italian invasion, try and find images of Libya. A key word for you is Senussi. Okay, the Senussi people. We had the Senussi wars that took place in Libya. Have a look at the Libyan population and what they look like. And you'll find that the Libyan population, if you don't go very far back, looked very, very similar to the Sudanese population. And that might shock people. Okay. The Libyan population looked very similar to the Sudanese population, and actually had the same thing with Egypt as well, but we'll come on to that in a moment. So what's happened to change the Libyan population from looking like a dark-skinned African population in our lifetime? Okay, well, not in our lifetime, maybe in our grandfather's lifetime, but in the last century, maybe century and a half. What's changed the Libyan population from looking like Sudan to looking like it currently does, which is essentially now just looking like, it's getting very close to being almost a Turkic population, very pale. What's happened? Well, I'll tell you what's happened. 2 genocides have happened, and I think you knew the answer to that. So we had obviously the Senussi wars that took place, the invasion by Mussolini, and I think it was the theory or the figure was, and I'm not sure if this is true or not, but it's always been thrown around, is that Libya's population was reduced from 7 million to 1 million. And I'm not laughing in a kind of, I'm saying just the shock of hearing that is appalling. I hope that's not true, because that would be obviously, that's genocide on a scale that your mind can't even fathom. But what we do know is, irrespective of what the number exactly was, Libya's population was tiny, by the way. And if you, once again, going back to looking at the maps and the land masses, Libya is a humongous nation. It really is very, very large. So just going, having a look at the map there, there's Libya over here. It's like twice the size of Egypt and probably half the size of Europe. One nation. And when the Italians invaded it, you know, and the Senussi Wars, they wiped out a huge mass of the Libyan population. And one has to believe that a large part of that was melanated. Even after that, Libya still had a very massive black population. In particular, one of the cities that had a very big black population was Sirte, a city that you probably all heard of and are probably aware of the fact that it was one of the many cities in Libya that in the recent war, the 2013 war, sponsored by your favorite President Obama, the remaining black population was essentially massacred. They called them, you know, African mercenaries. Do you remember that term being thrown around saying, oh, you know, Gaddafi's hired African mercenaries? That was basically code word for Arabs, feel free to go into Libya and kill any black people that you see because we want to finish what we've started. I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically I was just raising that to raise the point of how quickly the phenotype of a nation can change, because our children will grow up and they'll believe that Libya, just like we probably believe to some degree, Libya was always like this, you know. But how quickly that happens, especially if there's no one there to tell their tale. If there's no one there to tell their tale, then we just, oh, well, Libya's always looked like this, just like Egypt's always looked like that, and just like all these other nations have always looked like that. But it's not always the case. So it's just, yeah, but it's interesting to know. I know I went on a bit of a rant there, but I thought it'd be interesting to kind of like raise that. Let me catch up. Let's see. Arabs and Persians definitely dominated the Swahili coast, though. Did they, though? I'd like to hear more on that. I would like to hear more on that. I don't want to write that off. But once again, I'm leaning towards the fact that the people being classified as Arabs, were they Arabs? Were they actually Arabs? Because a lot of the people who had, I know if you're talking about the Zanj, I don't know what to call it. You know, there's the wars against the Zanj people, so to speak. I don't know what you want. I don't know if I've stated that correctly, but once again, I've you know, in reading that, I lean towards the fact that these were Africans. Once again, these are Arab-speaking African peoples. So, but it's interesting, and it's a fair point. Soul Journey of Life the Light, thank you for your $5 donation. He says, so Christianity was externally imported and Islam internally imported. Interesting. Well, I'd disagree with that as well, because I would say that Christianity was definitely on the African continent before it was in Europe. And I say that with all seriousness. Okay, Christianity was 100% part of the African continent. And this is one of the things that we've once again just taken for granted. It actually says that in the Bible itself. There's a disclaimer. I'm always quite interested when I see disclaimers. I noted this when I grew up in a Christian household, and I read this in the Bible, and I knew instantly it was a disclaimer. I was like, why has this Bible got a disclaimer? Because I noticed it straight away. There's a chapter or a verse, I should say, in Acts, in the book of Acts, where essentially, I think it's Peter. It's talking about the Apostle Peter. And it talks about the fact that it's kind of like tells you his story. Then it says, after that, he went to Ethiopia and he preached the gospel and they all received Christ. And that is the reason why the Ethiopians have the same Christianity that we do over here. And I'm like, well, that's a bit weird the way they just popped up that little disclaimer in the Bible. Oh yeah, by the way, Christianity already exists in Ethiopia, but we have an explanation for that. It's because Peter went there and preached. Just like, no, that sounds like a disclaimer. And I just always remember noting how that was written in the book of Acts, because it felt so out of place to the whole tone of the whole book. And I was like, that's a disclaimer. That's someone, a man, not God. That's a man writing down a reason as to why these people on this part of the continent or this continent has this faith already. and they're trying to explain that they had it first. So Christianity already existed in Africa prior to, obviously we know we had a different form of Christianity that was spread by, the, what do they call them? The evangelists. I can't remember what they call them, but the people that came around, the Europeans who came and used that as a means for, calling all of our things wicked. But at the same time, there still was an indigenous element of Christianity. And I think it was an indigenous element of Christianity that existed all across Africa, not just restricted to the Ethiopian or the Coptic church and, the Zimbabwe. Certain elements in Zimbabwe, I actually believe it was continent-wide, a religion that was already there and religion that was already known and practiced in different forms. But yes, it's very interesting. But yeah, Islam certainly, I think, was definitely internally spread. I'm going to go through some more comments really quickly. The Curse of Haman, I think his name... Okay, no, that's not to me. I want to try and get ones that are aimed at me. There were other Asiatic groups that migrated into Africa before Arabs and Islam, such as the Assyrian and the Persian invasions of Kemet. Yes, so, yep. I mean, yes, certainly there was definitely invasions, but invasions and enslavement and colonization are different things. So I think it's important that we kind of identify the fact that people have invaded each other all the time. Africans have invaded each other. Invasions have always taken place. But when we talk about the spread of a certain form of belief, or the spread of a slave trade, or the wiping out of an indigenous belief system, that's something that's a little bit different that we're trying to kind of surface here. But yes, it's very important to know that. North of Nigeria is made up of Hausa, Fulani, and other minority tribes, the latter systematically oppressed by the first two. Yes, I'm not going to argue with that. The Fulani assimilated, that's why they consider themselves white Arabs, even though they were dark-skinned. I'm going to say it again, the Fulani assimilated and consider themselves white Arabs. I don't know if that's true or untrue, but I know many Fulani people, and none of them look white to me. Well, Africans do weird things, so I'll leave that there. I could tell that from experience. Yep, the Ethiopian Enoch and Philip, not Peter. Thank you, RJ Mackenzie. It wasn't Peter, it was Philip in the Bible. And the Ethiopian eunuch, yes, there you go. Yeah, that's the story I was telling about. But that's a disclaimer. I don't care what anyone says. I know what I've read, and that's definitely a disclaimer. 100k years ago, we crash landed on this planet on our way back to Sirius star system. The mothership was probably a pyramid half the size of the Earth. Just a fun guess. Interesting. I'm of the school of thought that I won't say anyone's incorrect. There's stranger things that have happened on this planet. I'm telling you, or plain, depending on what school of thought you're from. Ethiopians had the first Christian church and practiced Christianity. Absolutely, and that's indisputable. Yeah, I'm not gonna go into the Christian. I'm not gonna go into that. I was gonna talk about Kemet and the effect that Christianity actually had, or at least the Coptic church was one of the biggest destroyers of early Kemetic artifacts there were. That's quite interesting. But I'm not going to go into that right now. I can't wait to educate my kids using the uncovered history of the actual peoples and not the lies I grew up on. So actually, I think at this point, I did throw out the question, and I said, which of the three theories, we've been dwelling on these for, which of the three theories did you lean towards? And I think a lot of people, I don't think I'm actually quite surprised. Not a lot of people have said the mainstream theory holds that much appeal to them. And I'm actually quite surprised, maybe because I approached it with a mocking tone, but I thought more people would kind of like lean towards the mainstream theory. A lot of people said melanated everywhere. That's certainly what I lean towards. And then there's the other theory that no one really moved and that we were all sold a lie. Now, I guess the question, well, at least the response I'm going to give you now is that my belief is actually there's a little bit of truth in all of them. And I know that's a little bit of a cop-out, But I want to present them as a bit of extremes so I could then talk about the fact that the history of melanated people is so complex, because essentially you've got people who have different schools of thought about where we all came from, where melanated people came from. So you've got people that will swear blind, all melanated people come from Africa. If you're from the West Indies, you're African. If you're from America, you're African. And we're talking about recently African, i.e. you're taken there via the slave trade. And basically all people who look dark-skinned or have that kind of like melanated and looking ancestry, you're all a result of slave trade and result of movement from Africa. Now, whereas obviously I don't believe this to be true, I do believe there's truth in it. And what's the truth I believe in it? I do believe there was this transatlantic slave trade. I think I've seen enough, and I say this with no irony, because you're like gonna go, well, duh, of course there was a transatlantic. But actually, there was a point in time not too long ago where I thought the whole thing was made up. I was like, there was no transport, there was no slave trade. And my theory was quite simple: show me the slave ships. If you can't show me the ships, then I'm not believing it. It's BS. And one of the reasons I had this viewpoint is because obviously being from Nigeria, and not having this kind of population impact, you have to understand something like the transatlantic slave trade, where one nation has been responsible for, or one nation is, largely accused. You largely say, oh, they all came from Nigeria, don't they? One nation has been responsible for people in the entire planet with melanated people, and yet that nation remains the most populous nation in Africa and one of the most populous nations in the earth, and doesn't really have a massive oral history of such a massive slave trade. I mean, the slave trade exists, but it's just like, it doesn't sound massive. So I was like, bun this, it doesn't make any sense. I don't think it's true. I think it's all been made up. However, I've seen more recently, but in the last few years, I have seen the evidence to suggest that certainly there was a slave trade. But I guess one of the things that I'm going to feed out there, and this is something that people may not be aware of, but I'm just going to feed out some logistics to you. The journey from the west coast of Africa to the Americas on a slave ship was a 4 to 5 week journey. Okay? It was a 4 to 5 week journey. The average slave ship, I'm not sure how many people it carries, but I would say at the adventurous end, maybe your average, a big slave ship carries 500-600 people. So I want you to do the maths here, okay? And this is what I do when I'm confronted with these things. I always do a little bit of basic maths. If I'm talking about a ship that carries 500 people, a large slave ship carries 500 people over to the Americas, and it's a 5 week journey. One ship going full tilt is only going to be able to make 5 journeys, because 10 weeks is the round trip from one end to the other. So one ship going full tilt non-stop from coast to coast every year is going to be able to make 5 journeys. So let's do a bit of quick maths. 5 times 500 is 2,500. So 2,500 slaves a year on a big ship going full tilt. So then I would ask the question, how many of these ships would you need to transport, maybe at the height of the slave trade, 1 million slaves a year? How many would you need? So 2.5 times 400,000. That times 4 is 10,000 times 40, 100,000. You need 400 ships going full tilt. I just done that really quick maths. Full tilt. No errors being made. No cargo or people being lost. Going full tilt to transport 1 million slaves a year. Now, we know that many ships didn't exist. We know that for a fact. Nowhere near. In fact, they don't have any slave ships left. So this is one of the problems, one of the many, many problems I had. On a logistic level, it just doesn't work. So whereas I believe there was a slave trade, it certainly wasn't responsible for what we see around the world today, which is essentially melanated people existing on every continent. And you could go through and you can look this up. I mean, I'm sure most of you have done this research before, but let's look at a few different kind of groupings of people. Thank you. Okay. So has anyone heard of the Caucasians before? Now, the Chagos Archipelago, okay, is a group of islands that the British colonized called Diego Garcia, or at least it's called the Diego Garcia, and they have essentially, the British have their fleet there. It's in the middle of the Indian Ocean, okay, and there are indigenous people on this island or on these islands that cannot get their land back from the British. And you know what the British excuse is for not giving their land back? They are telling these people, well, you're transported slaves. Now, if you have a look at the Caucasians, you'll know instantly that these people are not transported slaves, okay? They are indigenous, and they will tell you from their own mouth, we are indigenous. This is our land. We're not a result of slavery or being transported. This is where we are from. So one of the things that this story taught me is that, yes, slaves were transported, but don't get it twisted that won't be used as an excuse by the British to transport people to different to steal land that doesn't belong to them. Don't think that at all. Don't think at all they won't use it as an excuse to explain away why melanated people exist on different parts of the planet. And you'll find one of the rules of thumb, whenever melanated people are raised throughout history, whenever melanated people are found in places that they're not supposed to be found, you will hear the slavery argument being raised before evidence has ever been put to the surface. So before any evidence is even being given or declared, people just say, oh yeah, slavery. It was a result of slavery. Yeah, they got there because of slavery. And what does that do? That instantly dulls the observer to the voice of the person who's making objections. Instantly, you can't hear them anymore. And actually, I think melanated people in general have done this. Okay, melanated people in general do this. We do this with your parents. Your parents will turn around to you and say, you know, I'll be honest with you. So, for instance, I know people. I met a guy at the gym the other day. So I'm just giving you a bit of a story just to kind of paint a picture. I met a guy at the gym the other day, and basically, it's a friend of mine. But we talk every now and then. But I noticed that he had blue eyes. Okay, dark skinned guy with blue eyes, West Indian or Caribbean, I should say. And I said to him, "Oh, you're Bayesian," and he goes, "How do you know I was Bayesian?" And I said, to him, your parents and you have Irish ancestry, correct? And he said, how did you know I have Irish ancestry? I said, because the Irish were transported to Barbados, and the Irish were dark-skinned with blue eyes. And a lot of people don't know that. And you know what his response was? The only reason I raised that is because his response was, oh, my granddad told me that we're from Ireland, and I never took him seriously. And that playbook has played out 1,000 times, I think, amongst melanated people across the globe when they're told things. It's not like we're not told. It's that we allow our education to override the words of our elders. We allow our education to override the testimony of our elders. How many African Americans have been told by their grandfather? I remember hearing about, for instance, what's her face? Tina Turner. She's a famous one. Her grandmother was Native American. And not only was she Native, she had images of, having long, had all the attire, everything. Her family, blood, definitely Native American. Now, she did a genealogy thing with Skip Gates, Dr. Lewis Gates, and the genealogy came back and said, "Nah, you're African. You're 100% African. You ain't got any. You haven't got any Native American." And so, what do you think Tina Turner did? She did what most melanated people do. She turns around and she goes, "Oh, I guess my grandma was wrong." And I was like, "No, your grandma wasn't wrong. Your grandma was. If your grandma's telling you, she's not some crazy woman who just decided that she was going to dress up and pretend that she was a Native American one day. She could show you her parents. She grew up. She's 100% Native American. She told you where she's from, but we override the words of our elders. We override the stories that we're given, and we give precedence to an education system that limits us and limits our perspective on what truth is. And I think that happens globally. That happens with us globally. We do this globally. So just like these Cogossians that I've got on the screen at the moment, they'll tell you, no, Diego Garcia, or that place you called the Cagos, that's where we're from. That's where our ancestry's from. The British will turn around and go, "No, you're not from there. You're slaves." And everyone will turn around, "Oh no, if they say you're slaves, you must be slaves." So it's an interesting one. Let me get back to some talk. Brother Cadwell said, "My brother, where the slave ships is a poor argument. We can ask, where are all the classic cars from the 1990s? Yeah, the classic cars are in museums, Cadwell. The answer to both is, like the cars, were decommissioned. Yes, you can decommission things and you can put them in museums. I can see every single classic car. There's photos of, in fact, photography was available in the mid 19th century. Slavery was abolished in the late 19th century. Show me a photo of a slave ship." So I think equally I could turn to you and say, no, that's a weak argument. To turn around and say, "Oh, well, they'll decommission." It sounds like the moon landing argument when they go, "Oh, well, we haven't gone back to the moon because we decided to destroy the ship that went to the moon because it was no longer useful for us. So we just destroyed it. We burnt all the tapes. We taped over them because there was a shortage of magnet." It's like, at what point do you go, "This is stupid"? At what point do you go, "Sorry, this is just not the behavior of people who, if something happened, the running, what's the word I'm looking for? The track record of human behavior is to treat such matters as this. Okay, there's a degree of posterity that would go to preserving at least a couple of the slave ships. Okay, there's a degree of posterity where you'd say, okay, let's preserve these. Now, once again, I'm not arguing that they didn't exist. I'm arguing they certainly didn't exist to the scale that they're being sold. Okay, because they have to sell slavery at a certain scale in order to defend the peopling of the entire globe with melanated people. And I'm just suggesting that scale has been exaggerated. It has been fabricated. It has been somewhat, blown out of proportion. That's all I'm suggesting. Okay. But yeah, so I think there should be, like I said, there should be more evidence for it, and I just don't think it's there. Okay. Sounds like a bit of cognitive dissonance, the Nigerian version of white guilt, perhaps. That's not scholarship, my brother. Don't know what that's in reference to. Feel free to, embellish that with some details. No fly zone. I'm happy to take criticism. Fire when it burns. His blue, white, and gold Jesus. Oh, okay. I don't know what that is. We have and won't arrivals and new arrivals. Don't know what that means. Wow, that's awesome. My white family's name is Adam and Eve, Mary, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Okay. Cheddar Man. Someone mentioned Cheddar Man. So Cheddar Man, for those of you who don't know, is the original, or what, they found the bones of the original British people, and they realized that he was a melanated man with straight hair, apparently. But I think that was just an artistic choice. Probably didn't have straight hair, he probably had curly hair, but anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But the point is that he was melanated, and not just Cheddar Man, but also the Romans that settled in York were also melanated people. So people have this idea that the Romans were of a certain racial stock. Well, the racial stock of the Romans that settled in the UK were melanated and very heavily melanated, like West Africans kind of melanated. And this is one of the reasons why West African ancestry, actually we haven't even talked about West African ancestry on European continent. So in fact, this is a good point to segue back. Okay. And actually this is a good point to go back to melanated everywhere theory. So I'm just going to quickly pull that back up again. So going back to this melanated everywhere theory that we kind of started talking about, one of the big things that I didn't touch on this melanated everywhere theory is the amount of ancestry that came, and this is something that I definitely believe really, really strongly in, the amount of ancestry that came directly from the European continent to the Americas. Okay, so from Europe to the Americas, and also from Europe to the Caribbean islands as well. I'm actually very much of the belief that most Caribbeans, and this is obviously just my belief once again, have a lot of a lot of data to support it, but I haven't got it with me, and this isn't probably the time or the place for me to go into it. But I believe a majority of Caribbeans don't come from Africa; they come from Europe. They were actually exiled Brits and largely exiled Brits and Irish. And I think there's lots and lots of evidence to support that as well. There were several eviction edicts that actually took place on the European and Spanish. I forgot to mention Spanish and Portuguese, but the Spanish ones were probably the ones that ended up in the Spanish-speaking islands, and I think the European ones are the British ones are the ones that ended up in the British-speaking places, and this is why you have kind of like the British city names that correspond with the Caribbean city names as well. That's quite a common trait as well. So they carry the same city names because essentially the people would have been transported from namesake to namesake. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. I'm not going to go into that whole theory right now, but I'm going to throw it out there as a little bit of a seed so that you could kind of keep an eye out for that. But that's something that I firmly believe. So the question is, are they all African originally? The answer in my perspective is yes, absolutely. There certainly were African originally at some point, but they weren't African at the point at which the transportation took place, and actually they wouldn't have identified as African at that point. So no one who had been living in Europe, no melanated person who had been living in Europe for the past 5,000-10,000 years has got to turn around and say, yo, I'm African, because they would have had no reason to do that. They would have been more European than most of the light-skinned or pale-skinned people that they came in contact with. And so therefore they would classify themselves as being European. And this is why we have terms you guys have probably seen already throughout Europe of swarthy, tawny, sanguine. I can't remember some of the other ones. Spanish, call it Moreno or whatever. You have all of these different Moorish, you have all of these different terminologies that essentially describe different, black obviously is another one, different shades of darkness that was basically existent throughout the European continent. And it's very common. You see it in Shakespeare's writings, you see it in several writings, and actually if you just go back prior to the 1800s, you realize that people of color, melanated people, were as common as day on the European continent. Now, what took place for them to all end up in different parts of the world? That is the question. And it's a series of very unfortunate events from what I've been reading, but it's a very, very interesting discussion to have. I started having quite a good discussion actually with Dr. Cord Whittaker. So if you haven't checked out that live stream that I had with him, that was a little while ago now. It was about a couple months back. That was really interesting because he tackles this subject quite well. So yeah, in his book, The Black Metaphors. So That's definitely worth a read. I did buy it, by the way. Let me just quickly show that off on camera, because he's a friend of mine, so I don't mind plugging his book. If you don't mind me, just indulge me for a second as I do that. So there you go, Black Metaphors, hardback. Yeah, do pick it up. Fantastic book. Okay. All right. Yeah. Someone just said, and I agree, Seth Downer said, King's Monologue, you should make a series of videos about this topic because there's a lot of things that need to be covered. I agree. And I think what I wanted to do today is just touch on it. I really did. I really just want to touch on this topic because it's so large. And I think I also wanted to share with my community where I'm at, because I think it's quite important. And this is obviously me being quite indulgent now, but I'm going to be totally honest, and I'm always transparent with you guys. I don't lie to you at all. I want to be very transparent about where I am, because I think as I've had this channel, for a few months now, and I've obviously grown relationships and people have started really kind of like engaging with me personally and my content as well. I have different expectations that sometimes surface where people think that I'm a certain way. So people who are maybe of a, like I mentioned at the start of the live stream, maybe of a kind of like a very kind of religious mindset, have this expectation that I'm going to be, they want me to expand more on, the ancient Kemetic faith system and talk about how they should, pray and how they should approach their day. And I'm going to tell you right now, you're not going to get that from me at all, because this is purely historical for me. It really is. It's purely a historical exploit for me. I do love doing this, but purely from a scholarly point of view and a scholarly perspective. I have very little interest in assigning myself personally to a new kind of set of beliefs or a new faith system. And even if I did, I think it's beyond the scope. I'm not an evangelist. I'm not a preacher. I'm certainly not, built in that regard to do those kind of things. My approach is very much scholarly. So I wanted to kind of also share that I have quite unconventional viewpoint when it comes to where we come from. So another thing is I want to make it very clear that I don't have a conventional viewpoint when it comes to, everyone being African, although I use the term African a lot and I speak about African phenotypic diversity. I did want to make it also very clear that it doesn't necessarily mean that I believe that all black people come from Africa, because that then is buying, in my view, into the inferiority that we've been sold, i.e. that we were all restricted to one place until we were transported. And I think the evidence, the preponderance of evidence suggests that actually melanated people were first to every continent, and actually this world has become less diversified as a result of transportations that have taken place and as a result of racial stratification and a caste system that has separated society. And what that's actually caused is disparate groups of melanated ethnicities that don't have anything in common, that were proud of the geographic location that they were from, or proud of the part of the earth that they were from. Melanated people who perhaps were proud Arabs, but they were black, who were proud Persians, but they were black, who were proud Romans, but they were black, who were proud Brits, but they were black, who were proud Russians, but they were black, who were proud Australians, but they were black, who were proud Americans, but they were black, have now just been given this label and given this grouping and had all of that identity stripped from them. And now they've just become black, and then they're being told almost as a kicker that you must embrace Africa. If you do embrace Africa, I wholeheartedly support that, and I encourage you to. I actually personally believe there's a large degree, I actually think there's a large degree of ancestral, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a large degree of ancestral manifestation when it comes to the way that people react. And I had this from young, and I said this to my brother actually over dinner the other day. I said to him, I grew up in London, obviously. In London, you have largely Africans and Caribbeans. And of my Caribbean friends, I had, well, most of my friends were ones like, well, actually, no, of my Caribbean friends, I'd say it was about 50-50. I had 50% who would be like, you know, Jah Rastafari, Selassie, I go to their house, Africa, yes, my African brethren, come in, blah, 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 blah. Hugs, embraces. They'd literally look at me like, yeah, Africa's the one. Yeah, we'll go home one day. And they felt that connection. And then I'd have another 50% who'd be like, I mean, I like them African boy, you know. We have to bring that Africa to the yard, man. They just didn't like Africans. So you had one half that didn't like Africans really strongly, and then the other half that absolutely loved and adored African. I'm looking at it now, and actually I think I had this revelation from when I was really, really young. I actually think it's ancestral. I think the ones that didn't like Africans probably aren't African. How about that? It just makes it really simple. The ones that didn't like Africans probably aren't African. And the ones that did love me probably have roots in Africa. Because I think some of our behavior we just can't determine. It just kind of, it's been dictated by our ancestry. So if you go to Jamaica and you like people and they really dislike Africans, then maybe pay them a respect that they're not African. If someone turns around to you and tells you with enough conviction, I'm not African, maybe you got to believe them. Seriously. And it's the same thing when you go to America as well. It's the same thing. You get Americans who are like that, who really dislike being associated with Africa. I'm like, well, maybe they're Native American. Maybe their ancestry somewhere. Maybe they're British. Maybe they're Portuguese. Maybe their ancestry lies somewhere else other than the African continent. Yes, I know we're all African down the line, but that connection has to be something that I would say is relatively recent for you to feel that connection. So anyway, this might go over a lot of people's heads, okay? It might go over a lot of people's heads. And also, I might be incorrect, but at least this is my perspective and me being totally honest with this. Okay, so I wanted to be honest with you as my family. Okay, McFact says, King's Monologue, you're a fantastic content provider. You're never rude nor closed-minded. You always remain cool, calm, infinitely objective. Thank you, sir. Thank you for those words. I really appreciate that. Because when I do this type of stuff, these live streams, I'm never sure how they're going, especially one like this, which in all fairness, this is just a live stream of just us chit-chatting and me giving you my opinions for the past hour and a bit. And there hasn't been like, I haven't given you like data. I haven't given you like, you know, factual. This is just kind of like us just, mewing over a few different theories that we've been given as Black people. And I think we do need to definitely broach this topic with more detail next time. But I thought it would be a good start. All of Europe was swarthy 200 years ago, according to William Penn and Benjamin Franklin, with the exception of England. Yes, absolutely. That's what's been written. And there's no reason racist people would write that in literature if it wasn't true. So, and when I say racist people, yes, they were racist, particularly Benjamin Franklin. So, there you go. You mentioned that your first instinct was defensiveness and denial when being told the role Nigeria played in the slave trade. I never said I was defensiveness and denial. While providing no evidence to the contrary, where are the slave ships? I never said that. So no fly zone. I think you're trying to put words on me. I never felt any defensiveness and denial regarding Nigeria's role in the slave trade. In fact, I'll be quite open about Nigeria's role in the slave trade. Okay, I know the role that the homie played in the slave trade. I'm not defensive about it at all. I don't make any justifications for Nigeria's role in the slave trade. I certainly have already done videos about the fact that there was definitely a kingdom of Judah in West Africa, and actually there's been a lot of evidence to suggest that Jews were in Black Jews were in West Africa and were targeted as part of a Portuguese edict, which I'm going to go into. But I've done some research on that very recently, so it's really interesting to see that uncovered. But yeah, I think you got me twisted there, bro. Or you're putting words in my mouth. Either way, fix up. I don't know, this is a bit less of a scientific view. Nay says, yeah, it is, because it's hard to do science when there's so many different theories flying about, but we can definitely get to the science at some point. To be honest, Arabs and Berbers would have not such strong influence and power in Southern Europe without the help of black converted Muslim Moors. Well, what are modern Berbers? That is the question. And my answer to the question is modern Berbers are just essentially black Africans, i.e. Moors, mixed with European Slavs and some degree of Turkic/Ottoman influence. And actually, the ironic thing about the Berber or the Amazigh people, as they call themselves, they talk about North Africans like it's a race, and it's not. The North Africans, depending on their geographic location, are always more closely related to the Africans they're right next to. And that's one of the things that's largely overlooked. Okay. North African, for instance, Egyptians have got little or no relationship on any front to Moroccans. They do share a phenotype, but beyond the phenotype, they have no relationship, because Moroccans are a result of largely West Africans mixing with European Slavs, and Egyptians are the result of excuse me, Turkish and Mamluk influence mixing with Greeks, mixing with probably some native Egyptians down the line. Two very similar phenotypes, resulting in actually, essentially beige looking, very mixed race looking people, but completely different origins. So the fact that they call themselves North Africans, like it's a thing, it's not a thing. You get that right across North Africa. Excuse me, I got a bit of a frog in my throat. Tahar Qatar says 97% of black Americans and Caribbeans are born with a Mongolian spot. The only tribe in West Africa who are born with Mongolian spot are the Ile Ife, 50 to 70%. You do the math. That's very interesting. Be interesting to know what your conclusion is regarding that. So you're suggesting that they all descend from Ile Ife. My argument would be that that might be the case. But once again, what's the timeline on that? Because this is the issue. My issue is not that people don't come from Africa. My issue is, what is the timeline? And at that point of things taking place, such as the slave trade, etc., did they classify themselves as African or something else? But very interesting. I've never heard of that before. I don't even know what a Mongolian spot is, and that's me being totally honest with you. I'm just going through the comments, by the way. What I'm reading when I go silent like this. Jewish Ibos is a thing. It must be. I already spoke about the fact that Ibos can translate certain Hebrew terms directly into their language. And these are terms that Yiddish Jews are unable to translate as well, which is more interesting. So that suggests a very close tie to some of those kind of untranslated Hebrew phrases that are in the Bible. And also someone else pointed to me the fact that Igbo sounds a bit like Hebrew. Igbo Hebrew is quite interesting. It's interesting, to say the least. But I even had my friend who is a Christian. Excuse me. Actually, one of my friends, my brother-in-law, to be totally honest with you. I had my brother-in-law who is a Christian, even had him questioning, because he went and he was the one who went away and he asked his sister, who's Igbo, and he just gave her the phrase. He didn't tell her where it was from. He said, "Can you translate this?" And she says, "Yeah, it translates to such and such, the baby, blah, 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 blah." I was like, wow. And then he came back and he told me, and I was like, whoa, there you go. And that's interesting, isn't it? Let's carry on. North Africans cannot be a thing, but black Portuguese can be a thing. You got to be fair. You said we shouldn't strip people's identity. If that's what North Africans call themselves, from your theory, then I don't know what you mean by that. Black Portuguese can be a thing. Portugal's a country. I don't understand what you mean. North Africa is just kind of like it's a geographic mass. So that's what the difference is. It was just given that label because essentially they wanted to group together the people from that are north of the Sahara, but then they don't have any. There's no linkage there. You need something there. You need either a linguistic link or a cultural link. Okay, I guess you could say Arabic could be the linguistic link. You know, but you need some kind of a link that groups the people together, an ethno-cultural link, so to speak, and that's what I don't think. I think it's just a convenient racial link, which doesn't really mean anything. We're all beige, so we're gonna call ourselves this thing, irrespective of the fact that we're not related to one another. It's a bit bizarre, but that's just my opinion. Soul Journey says, your scholarly efforts building upon melanated history in a way that respects your own views and at the same time others is much appreciated. Salute. Thank you. And I appreciate the fact that this live stream hasn't wound people up completely. We've got 156 people currently in here. So I appreciate that because I wasn't sure how this is going to be taken. It was very random. So I appreciate you. Thank you very much for that. Tracy, my biggest supporter, I appreciate you so much. She says, I believe we were on other continents before the slave trade. Me too. We're finding out the Indians in the Americas sold back natives into slavery. This means we were already here originally. Let's do more research on this topic. Absolutely. It's certainly a topic that deserves several videos and discussions, much more well researched than this one. I really just wanted to surface the topic on this one, but I totally agree with you and I appreciate the donation so much. I really, really do. Thank you so much, Tracy. I really appreciate it. Have you heard about the ape man and the ape woman? I can hardly believe that, unless I'm dumb, deaf and blind. I don't know. I haven't heard of that, Adept. So I can't expand on that. I always try to tell North Africans this. I keep saying North Africa is like the Brazil of Africa. Excellent analogy. It's a geographical region, not a race. There's native black North African tribes like the 12. And you know why that's such a good analogy, Charmin Aquarius? Because Brazilians have very similar phenotype. I say Brazilian, sorry. South America has a very similar range of phenotypes as North Africans, because even actually look at North Africans, they actually look very different. I can actually normally tell, Algerians apart from Moroccans. And a lot of people just can't tell any of them apart. They think Arabs look the same. First of all, Arabs do not look like North Africans. But then Arabs don't look like each other. I mean, it's so random. There's so much. If you want to appreciate phenotype, you can do that. And actually that kind of is a bit of a broader conversation, but it's really important to have because this goes back to this topic as a whole. One of the things I like to do, me and the missus do watch a bit of Netflix, but one of the things that I like to do that really irritates her, but I'm able to do it all the time, is we'll watch a show and you may or may not have noticed, but there is a very much a kind of like a trend for picking up British and, essentially British actors and putting them in American shows and American sitcoms and American this, that and the other. And American films, American movies. Lots and lots of British actors coming through now. And one of the things that I'm always able to do with no effort whatsoever is point out when there's British actors. I don't know them, haven't seen them before, but we're watching the show and I'll be like, they're not American. And Mrs. will be like, how do you know that? She doesn't. My honest answer is they don't look American. Because to me, and this could be just be me, but to me, Americans have a completely different phenotype. So I was able to pot them out. I think one show, and I'll just give you an example, one show I was able to do this really easily. There's the new Bel Air show. I don't know if you've watched that. That's the kind of like the new spin on the Fresh Prince of Bel Air. They've got a new show. And the boy who plays Carlton, I said straight away as we watched it, I said, he's African. And I said, specifically, he's West African. He's probably Ghanaian or Nigerian or something like that. I looked at him straight away and I was like, he's definitely not American. And she's like, you sure? And obviously went and checked Google, he's African. I was like, well, that wasn't even hard. He doesn't look American. Same thing happened when I watched Get Out, David Kaluuya. I watched it straight away and I was like, he's British. I just knew he was, even though his American accent's amazing, but I was like, he's British. I knew he was British because he looked African, but I could tell from his mannerisms that he was British African. I could just tell straight away. I was like, he's not American. He doesn't look American. Now, essentially, what am I saying here? The point of what I'm saying is that we're all melanated. But if I can tell you quite effectively, and you'll see this from my channel if you've seen my reconstructions, I differentiate between ethnic groups, melanated ethnic groups, a lot. I say, I saw this and I thought of this ethnicity. I saw this face and I thought of this ethnicity. I saw this nose and I think of this ethnicity. I saw these eyes. If I can see differences between ethnicities in Africa, and I can see differences between ethnicities in Nigeria, I do that all the time. I'll be like, he's not Yoruba, or he's Yoruba, he's Igbo, he's Fulani, he's, I can normally just spot them easily. He's Akan, he's this, he's that. If you look hard enough, you can see these, and I can see it in Americans as well. So normally I can pick out Americans like that. I'll be like, no, he's another show I did it in was it's a show of Issa Rae. It's the one that she produced. I can't remember what it's called. Someone will put the name down. But it's a show of Issa Rae. It's the one that she produced, and her best friend in that show. I was like, she's African. I could just tell straight away. I was like, that's an African woman. That's not an African American. That's an African woman. Now, slave ship theory says I shouldn't be able to do that, but I can. So then you have to explain that. Why am I able to do that? If they're all just all they are just simply, Nigerians. Why am I able to differentiate them? Because I think if you want to, or if you can, essentially, because there's something down the line with the ethnicity that's gone on that's slightly different there, and I think people will be in denial about this being the case, but to me, it's not hard to do. And even someone actually said to me in my comments recently that they thought I was Jamaican. And actually, I got that a lot growing up. People tended to think I was Jamaican growing up in London, but they normally could tell kind of like... So there was obviously something going on with my phenotype that leaned towards... Otherwise, why would people make that distinction? Because we all talk with British accents. There's no distinction to be made there. So you can. The point I'm making is, and I know I've kind of gone off on on a bit of a rant here, but the point I'm making is that if you try to see differences between ethnicities, you'll realize that melanated people are very ethnically rich, and it's actually easy to spot the differences. I always speak about the fact that I used to live in Qatar, and in Qatar's Qatar has a massive black population, by the way. I think it's about 40% of the population of Qatar's population is black Qataris. Now, the first thing I said when I saw black Qataris and I spoke to them is that, and this is going to sound really weird, they look African American. They're in fact the only group or black group outside of America that reminded me of African Americans. So I don't know if they're even Googleable, to be totally honest with you. But there was something about their phenotype that I thought they look African American. It was really, really weird. And every time I met them, I just thought, and actually there was actually an American base in Qatar. So every time I always used to think, I wonder if that's an American dressed up in, but it wasn't. They were literally black Qataris. And they just there's something about their look that looked very, very... Now, I don't know if there's a link there. I don't know if there's some kind of ancestral link between black Qataris specifically. So obviously Qatar's in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, or at least on the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. I don't know if there's a link there, but they looked African American. It was really, really bizarre. And this is not just because they were black and in the Middle East, because you've got a lot of blacks in the Middle East. For instance, Yemenis, Omanis look completely different. They look more like East Africans, the Yemenis and the Omanis. So I'm not talking about that. Even in Saudi Arabia, you get a lot of dark-skinned black there, but they once again more resemble Sudanese. But something about the black Qataris, they looked African American. So it's really weird. You just have these, you know, you have these weird kind of different traits that exist across these different peoples. Someone just said Moors, possibly. I mean, that would be a logical link. That would be a logical link. That would be very logical. And it would certainly, obviously, that would actually kind of like meet my own personal kind of biases towards what I think is the majority ethnic group in America, which I think is Moors. I think second is indigenous, and I think third is African. But that's a whole nother discussion. We won't go into that. I have nothing empirical to support that. So yeah, there's that. All right, so let's go through a few more comments, and then I'm going to release you because for those of us in Britain, it's 12:30, and this was an unplanned and totally unfair live stream that I just thrust upon you as a community. So I appreciate you guys coming out. Terrence said, wow, your honesty, I appreciate. I appreciate the fact that you appreciate it because you didn't have to. And that's me being totally honest. Kids monologue, wouldn't the phenotypic difference between African Americans and continental Africans be explained by intermixture with Native Americans and Europeans? Potentially. But that's if you believe there has been intermixing with Europeans and Native Americans. Maybe in some cases there hasn't. Have a look into Dr. Rick Kittles, because he's a black geneticist who did some genetic testing on the genomic testing, I should say, on the obviously he has his own company, but on the African American community, and he's done several where basically he has a massive database, and actually a large portion, a much larger than he expected portion of the African American community carries uniquely African American DNA / African DNA. Some of it's labeled African, but some of it is just uniquely African American, i.e. no admixture. Quite a large proportion, which was very surprising. What was even more surprising actually as well is within the range, the people who had 100% African American DNA with no European or Native American admixture exhibited the full range of skin tones. So it had no bearing on whether or not you were going to be light skinned and dark skinned. That was very, very eye opening. So regardless of if you had, so basically it didn't take a proportion of European or Native American ancestry to make an African American, or at least someone within the African American group, I should say black American, light skinned or dark skinned or medium skin. Didn't take that. It just literally they could be anything within the range. But however, the closer they got to being European, or the more European ancestry they had, they weren't able to access the dark range anymore. They were only able to access basically they lose, the more European ancestry, the more they lose their ability to be dark skinned. But you could be right at the extreme end of fully African American ancestry and be very, very light skinned. So once again, just kind of like nods to the whole discussion that we have about African phenotypic diversity, or I should say melanated phenotypic diversity. We as Africans can differentiate between different Africans pretty easily too. I agree. I'm African, so I agree with you. We can tell when someone comes from a neighbouring country even. Absolutely. And so this is, Salola, we're on a wavelength there. Olakunle said, King's Monologue, thank you, bro, for this one. It's a lot of food for thought as usual. Thank you again for doing what you do. Thank you, man. Like I said, I wasn't sure how this was going to be taken. To be integrated and plural is the African way. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Adept says Moors, Maroon, Moro, Maori, and gives a lot of different kind of more sounding. These are the original people of every land on earth. Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. That is something we need to get into. I think I have to go back to that comment and do some more research. That's a cool one. Thank you, Adept. I'm in Texas. It's 6 p.m. here. Just got off work. Thank you, Renaissance Woman. Thanks for letting me know what the time is over there. It's a good time for you guys. This has been a great live stream. In fact, thank you. 100. I don't know what that was in reference to. Nays, we said there 100% has been. Come on now. I've said so many things. Sorry, I lost you there. My aunt is 88% Nigerian. What does that mean, though? I agree. I mean, I'm not going to disagree, but what does that mean? Nigerian. What does that mean? Which of the 100 plus ethnicities of Nigerian is she? And how much of the stuff that's classified Nigerian is classified Nigerian because other African Americans carry it and they classify African Americans as Nigerian? Do you see where it's kind of like, ooh, you know, I'm kind of up and down a bit. Oh, AD says, I took Dr. Kittle's test in 2007. I am Fulani Yoruba from Nigeria. Very interesting. I'd love to get him on the show. That would be a wicked discussion to have. Deborah says, I think you're right. Deborah Akiva says, I think you're right. I saw the video with a woman from the Middle East and she looked very similar to myself as an African American. There you go. Have a look. Like I said, if you could find the categories in particular, specifically, there might be other groups. I'd imagine Black Bahrainis. I didn't meet many Black Emiratis, but I know there's Black Bahrainis as well. And I'd imagine they have a similar look or phenotype to the Black Qataris as well. So have a look, see if you can find any of them there. I always thought I didn't look Nigerian or other West African groups 100% until I seen a lot of Fulani people. So there you go. That might be, you know, a large proportion of your ancestry there. And there's no shame in that. I think sometimes people, can I just say, sometimes people feel like there should be some kind of offense taken when people kind of turn around and they'll be like, you know, I don't feel any affinity to Africans. You know, we've got this kind of thing. Obviously, I grew up in the 90s, and we have this kind of thing where it's kind of like, we don't want to be sellouts, all right? And no one wants to kind of like turn away and be like, you know, oh yeah. So the cool thing, the right thing is to say, oh yeah, I'm African. Listen, I think we have to grow to a point where we've matured in our research to say, if the data supports it, fine. But if it doesn't, then there's no harm. People aren't saying that they're not proud to be melanated. They're just saying there's a possibility that they could be from somewhere else, or they feel more affection to the land that they're in. I've never really understood that. Like, I've always said this, like, I don't even know why we use the term African American. That's me totally honestly being honest with you. I don't understand why we use the term. This is me being very political now, but I don't care. I'll just say what I feel. I don't even know why we use the term African American, because as far as the people that are in that nation currently, melanated people have been there the longest by any stretch. Yeah, you've definitely been there longer than the Irish, who don't call themselves Irish Americans. They call themselves American. You've been there longer than the Spanish. You've been there longer than all the other groups. And yet you have this kind of like other place attached to your name. It's like, I mean, I don't mind you calling yourself African American. I love you, brothers and sisters and stuff like that. But really, you're the true Americans. And this is regardless of if you have or believe you have native ancestry or Moorish ancestry or African ancestry. Regardless of that, at which point do you say we've been here for several hundred years and we've been here longer than everyone, so therefore we're American and you're European American, so therefore the new name should be we're American, you're European American, you're this American, but we are American. I don't know, that's just my point of view, but could be wrong there. I'm very braggadocious. I'm very much kind of like unashamed in kind of like the melanated imprint and ownership of the world. So I kind of feel like we're owed that respect. That's just me personally. Now we have completely mapped the human genome. Now we know without a shadow of doubt what everyone but Afrocentric. Okay, here's Hassan. We haven't completely mapped the human genome, Hassan, actually. We're very, very far from it. It's funny that you find yourself here on my stream able to call people names. But the problem is, like I said, we haven't mapped the human genome. Okay, in fact, I've spoke about the fact that if you knew anything about the way haplotyping is done, more genetic markers are ignored, far more ignored than the ones that are actually paid attention to. So all that's essentially happened is you've created a map that's convenient to yourselves, and it's not based on a very thorough database either. It's heavily skewed towards where most of the testing is done. So yeah, unfortunately you're incorrect. But yeah, I would say I appreciate you being here, but you can leave and tell me like. We are West Indian American, as America is the West Indies. Interesting, yes. I need to do more research on the origins of, I think I was watching a video actually recently, and they spoke about the fact that India used to be called Hindustan. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Dante Forston or something like that. I can't remember. Or Dane Calloway. I can't remember. There's a few people out there who kind of put out quite interesting videos. Once again, not wholeheartedly co-signing him, just saying I find their videos interesting. But they put out the fact that India used to be called Hindustan, and it was actually called India after the fact. So after the Indians in America were called Indians, they started calling the Indians in Asia Indians, to create the confusion. Now, I could be wrong. I could be wrong there. Or this could have been wrong. I'm saying I could be wrong. I'm just saying what I heard. That could be right or could be wrong. I'm not sure how far back that goes. Afro is a hairstyle. Yes. Based on a place. I don't know. King's monologue. Jesse Jackson popularized the term African American to put Black Americans on par with immigrants groups to the US. Did it put them on par? I think it put them below it, because the immigrant groups just called themselves Americans after one. It's interesting. We have that over here. We had massive amounts of Polish immigration that took place in the UK 20 years ago, and all of the Polish people's children don't call themselves Polish because they might have Polish surnames, but essentially they got white skin, so they just say we're British. Now, me as a black, my kid's a third generation British at this point. I'm a second generation Brit. My kid's a third generation British. They're still going to be asked what their ethnic identity is or their ethnic origin is. The Polish people that came 10 years ago aren't going to be asked that question. They're just going to go to a thing and it's going to be, yeah, I'm British. Okay, cool. And no one's going to ask them what their ethnic origin is. They won't have to ever tick the box to say that they're Polish. So I say that in relation to what Jesse Jackson did. Did it put them ahead? Or wouldn't it have been simpler to just say we're not going to be called Afro-Americans anymore, you can just call us Americans? I don't know. I could be greatly oversimplifying things here. The Americas on some maps is India superior. Interesting. Thank you. It is incorrect. Stop using it. Okay. I'm just trying to make sure I haven't missed anything. I think... So Hindustan Bharat became India in 1948. The original India was the Americas. So there you go. Tahaka Tarseti. If you're correct, there you go. What you've just said there is very interesting. It's very, very interesting. So yeah, that's interesting, because then the name Indian is not an offensive name. All right, I'm going to leave it there because it's been 2 hours, believe it or not. And I am rambling at this stage, probably because I'm really tired and I need to go to sleep. Thank you for joining me for this rather unprepared and certainly there was a lot of improvisation going on here, but I think it was good for us to just have this conversation. Like I said earlier, I think, yeah, I just want to have this conversation with you as my community, so you kind of know where I stand, which is a very unconventional line. I think going back to what I said before, my viewpoint is that there's a little bit of truth in all of these tales. And that's simply because melanated people have massive and have always had massive amounts of reach. And actually what's taken place is that we've all been grouped together from using this term black or Negro, has been kind of thrust upon us. And now we're just kind of trying to find our way. Now, it's a bit of a loose theory. You are welcome to pick holes in it, but it's the one that I think all of my research has led me to. But I very, very much have enjoyed having this conversation with you. And I really appreciate the fact that people have been very nice to me in the comments, because I think you could have come for me in this, but you're being, everyone's been absolutely fantastic. So I appreciate everybody in this live stream today, and I'm going to call it a day now. It's late. Yeah, God bless you all, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.